Hey there everyone, welcome back to the channel where today I have a full review, my review of Coaster Studios' brand new documentary, This Is How We Roll. Now if you're a coaster enthusiast and you're in the scene, you've probably been aware of and following updates on this documentary for quite a while. And if you're new to the scene, you're probably wondering what the heck this documentary is all about. Taylor Bybee, as well as the rest of his team, have been working on this documentary, as far as I'm aware, for quite a while to deliver the story of Rocky Mountain Construction, one of the premier coaster manufacturers in the theme park industry. This documentary is meant to cover the beginning of RMC from its conception as a company all the way to its award-winning status today. So in this video, I just wanted to cover my initial thoughts after watching the documentary for the first time and sharing them with the rest of the community. Now, I just want to start right off the bat and say that I think this documentary is a huge accomplishment for the folks over at Coaster Studios, as this is a significant jump from what they've been producing over the past couple of years on their YouTube channel. Coaster Studios' Taylor started as essentially a kid and has worked his way up all the way to producing a feature-length documentary. And I think regardless of whether you think it's really good or not so good, it's still really impressive for someone to climb that ladder of media creation all the way to where he is today. I also think if you're a coaster enthusiast, it's kind of undeniable that this is one of the coolest and best produced things to come out of the coaster enthusiast community. Aside from the normal POV and ride review and vlog, this is kind of the step up from that, and I think it's just really cool to see a major release come from someone who's embedded into that community as well. Now, I should also say I'm not just a coaster enthusiast, I'm also a pretty big film buff on the side, and I'm also a huge fan of the documentary medium, which I think is really notoriously hard to produce and make compelling. So this kind of scratched all my itches as far as something I was really interested in. I'm really interested in coasters and theme parks, but I'm also really interested in movie making and documentaries in general. So to make this easy for you guys to watch and for me to organize my thoughts, I've broken down my thoughts into an initial list of pros and cons, and I've even numbered them so someone as simple as me can kind of follow along. So let's go ahead and start off with the pros. Pro number one, production values. I think, again, it's kind of undeniable that the production values on this documentary are really, really nice. And normally in low budget projects, especially ones historically that have come from the YouTube side of things, there's a lot of obvious technical issues, whether it's an out of focus camera or poor lighting or specifically audio troubles, which tends to trouble everyone, myself included, and I really didn't notice anything to the film's detriment in this department, and that's a good thing. If you don't notice it, it means they're probably doing something right. And the things I did notice are good things, like really nice cinematography. There's some really great drone shots in this. There's some footage of roller coasters from unique angles because they had nice behind the scenes access. So there's a lot of really positive things from the technical side that make the documentary really, really easy to watch, and also lends itself to a high level of production and skill that was involved in the making of the movie. There's also a full score to go along with this movie, fully orchestrated soundtrack in the background, and again, that's pretty impressive for someone who just started out making coaster parodies on YouTube and has sort of elevated their game to this level. On to number two, scale. I think the scale of this documentary is pretty impressive. There's multiple locations, different theme parks throughout the United States, and then the RMC headquarters themselves there in Idaho. And that's quite a lot of ground to cover, and they've done a really nice job sort of blending that whole story together. And again, it takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and a lot of skill to actually get the footage from those locations. So I think it speaks to their dedication in order to make a documentary that pays tribute and pays due diligence to all of the places that RMC has had its fingers and impacted in throughout the years of its creation. Number three, anecdotes and character moments. There's a lot of really good character moments through some of the subjects they look at in this documentary, namely Fred Grubb, the creator of RMC and its founder, and Alan Schilke, who's involved with many of the coaster designs at RMC. They do a good job of making them are taking them beyond their place as just coaster icons and then elevating them to people, which is really what documentaries should and are supposed to be about, which is the people behind the things that they're covering. And so the character moments that they do have in the movie do a really good job at fleshing out those characters and making them the people that they are beyond just someone who did something, which is a trap I feel like a lot of documentaries fall into. They cover what the person did, but not the person behind it, which is really half, if not more, of the story. There's a lot of really good humorous moments throughout that show the relationship between employees and former staff members. And then on top of that, there's some well-researched bits, both about the history of the company, but as well as the family and their backgrounds. And some really good incorporation of the family of Fred Grubb, behind RMC who helped the company get to be where it is today. And of course, Fred Grubb as a person. And I think that's one of the themes of the movie. Well, if you were to thematicize and break it down into categories, that, you know, the importance of his family involved in the creation of the company. So all of that stuff I thought was pretty successful as far as making the film emotionally impactful. And then lastly, number 4, I think this covers everything as a coaster enthusiast you would expect an RMC documentary to cover. They cover all of the rides, whether it's Steel Vengeance or Lightning Rod or Iron Rattler or New Texas Giant, and they cover all of the big names you've heard of like Fred Grubb and Alan Schilke, etc. And I think it covers the chronology of RMC as a company well enough that even if you weren't a coaster enthusiast, you can still follow along and understand where the company started and then where it got to today, and that sort of arc and meteoric rise that the documentary is portraying to you, the viewer, that this is a company that started from the bottom, and to quote my boy Drake, now they're here. As a bonus, the end credits in the documentary are really cool. I honestly thought it was maybe the coolest part in the film. Whoever designed that, their name is in the credits. I forgot it, so I'll put it here. 2 thumbs up. Both of them. Super cool, almost worth checking out just to see that. I thought it was really neat. Okay, now on to the cons. And again, I want to say I don't think any of these things really ruin the movie, but I like to think of this as like constructive criticism. I'm not trying to tear down the movie for the sake of it, but I think this is things that could definitely be improved on to make it a stronger standalone documentary instead of a companion piece to Coaster Studios' catalog and other things that the coaster community is already tracking. So first off, I should say that because the movie, I think, successfully makes the jump from YouTube to a full-length feature film, there's a different set of standards and expectations that it gets compared to. If you're making a 20, 30-minute YouTube documentary, it's kind of enough to cover the Wikipedia history of the creation of a ride or the creation of a theme park and deliver that to an audience with good voiceover and graphic effects. I think that's sort of the bottom line expectation. But when you make a feature-length movie, you all of a sudden have to tell and portray a good narrative that even someone who's uninitiated can follow and still follow both, yes, the plot itself, the narrative history, the contextual history, but then also a strong emotional impact that goes beyond just what the movie's about. For example, if you make a documentary about sandwiches, it needs to be about more than just the sandwich. So for number 1 on my cons list, and this is one of my bigger complaints about the movie, I think they really could have utilized a framing device here to help contextualize and tell the story. They kind of do this in the beginning where they say, 40 days until opening of Stunt Pilot, and it kind of makes you think that they're gonna tell a story about the run-up to the opening of Stunt Pilot and the construction of that and the design of it and then issues that come along the way. But it doesn't really do that. It goes more into the history of the company. Comparing this film to a documentary like The Imagineering Story on Disney+, whereas The Imagineering Story has such a long breadth of history to choose from, both with the creation of Disneyland and Disney World and Disneyland Paris and Shanghai Disney, and there's such a long storied history with multiple extremely famous people, of course, Walt Disney included. They're able just to tell that narrative element with behind the scenes details, and it makes it compelling. In this case, when you're telling a smaller scale story about someone who came from quote unquote nowhere and then rose their way up to revolutionize the industry, you have to sell that story on its own. And I think doing that with a framing device helps make the story more clear, as opposed to sort of a Wikipedia plot summary of what RMC has been doing in the industry for the past 15, 20 years. And I think as a coaster enthusiast, if you already know that, you might be a little bit, I don't want to say bored, but you kind of already know the story. And if you're not a coaster enthusiast, you don't necessarily have a reason to care that much about it because you don't really understand the emotional impact behind it as well as I think you could have. And all of that kind of just makes the documentary seem a little bit unfocused. It bounces around from park to park and coaster to coaster, but it never really settles on a subject, whether the subject is the making of a coaster, Fred Grubb himself, Alan Schilke, or RMC as a company. And I think with a little more tighter focus, it could have been more successful. I also think there was an opportunity here if you didn't want to do the making of one specific coaster. Some insight into the person behind the camera could have helped an uninitiated audience get more sucked into the world. So I understand maybe Taylor of Coaster Studios didn't want to insert himself into his own documentary, but I think maybe doing some sort of road trip movie where you go and drive from park to park, again, helps you give a better frame to view the rest of the story. And then you help unravel the story of RMC with some chronology behind it instead of just bouncing around kind of from park to park and place to place. And then if you're not a coaster enthusiast, you have an opportunity to be introduced to the world of being a coaster enthusiast. There's a lot of interviews in this movie with people, if you're in the community, who you'll think are pretty famous, whether it's BK Photo Page or Midway Mayhem and some ACE members. But again, if you're not in the community, you don't really know who those people are, and you don't have a world into the lens into the world of a coaster enthusiast. So without that, I think you're kind of missing a piece of the story. One of the inherent challenges of documentaries is that you're limited to what's happening in real time to an extent. And if you're covering a person in real time with real-time footage and not just archival footage and interviews, there has to be something interesting happening at that moment to capture. And I feel like where there are times in RMC's history that would have been very interesting to film, whether it's the initial creation of New Texas Giant or perhaps the creation of something like Lightning Rod or Steel Vengeance, because we're past that and we don't really get any footage into the design and idealization and construction of Stunt Pilot, again, you kind of miss one of the more interesting parts of the coaster building process, both for enthusiasts and for non-enthusiasts, which is building the coaster. There's nothing really here about designing the coaster, welding the steel, doing some of the engineering pieces of it, G-force tests, stuff that I really don't know about or haven't actually seen footage of that I would be really interested in, which isn't in the documentary. So part of that is personal preference. Maybe I knew a lot of the stuff in this documentary already, and maybe if you don't, it was more captivating. But I feel like if they covered that portion of it, that would have given me a view into something that I otherwise haven't seen or heard about elsewhere. That was sort of a long number one con, so I'll move on to number two here. And I kind of talked about this already, but it doesn't necessarily play as well, I think, to a non-enthusiast. And this is something I was not worried about, but kind of expected going into the movie, where they dropped the word airtime, I think like 2.5 minutes into the movie. And I could see someone who doesn't know anything about coasters be like, what's airtime? And so again, that lens into the community could have been really helped the movie out. And again, I understand why necessarily he wouldn't want to do it, but telling a little about the community itself, just in the very beginning as an intro, would have helped a lot to sort of sell why people even care so much about who a coaster manufacturer is, or the fact that there even are coaster manufacturers. And then lastly, number three on my cons list, I think the movie plays a little bit like an RMC commercial, which again is kind of another thing I expected in the movie. Before going into it, and that's not to say that I had negative expectations, but there's not a lot of drama or conflict here, and I think that could have made a more compelling movie. A lot of it goes to show, it starts with the conclusion that RMC has changed the industry, and then it just shows you how, but that's not necessarily a dramatic or compelling story, since you already know where you're going to end up, and then it just takes you there along the way without any conflict. There's a little mention about midway through the documentary about some troubles Lightning Rod had, but there's no real coverage of, I don't know, any design problems or challenges they faced along the way where things actually got negative. Again, if you were going to make a narrative story about RMC, that is to say like a biopic or a biopic, you could say, you could easily manufacture some drama. You know how you would write the screenplay, and then halfway through, I don't know, the coaster would break or something, and then, oh my gosh, the drama. And there's nothing like this in the documentary, which may just be a fact that in real life there wasn't any drama. However, I think things like that do happen in the manufacturing process, and they're just not shown in this documentary. I understand why. The company doesn't want to look bad, but it doesn't necessarily make for the most compelling story. Again, a framing device like covering the construction and development of Stunt Pilot would help show some of the challenges that come along the way with building a coaster. And again, I think that could be pretty compelling, especially since I know for a fact that both the Jersey Devil and Stunt Pilot had to close due to problems. So clearly these things do happen, and they're just not covered necessarily in the documentary. I get it. They want to tell an uplifting story, but I kind of needed a little bit of drama or conflict to make it more interesting, especially if you're not a coaster enthusiast. So all of that being said, I think This Is How We Roll is still a tremendous achievement, both for Coaster Studios, for Taylor, for Sarah, for Scott, for everyone involved in the production of this movie. And I think if you're a coaster enthusiast, it's absolutely 100% without a doubt, with a guarantee, worth a watch. There's really nothing like this of this quality that's been made for coaster enthusiasts by the coaster enthusiast community. And it really does give some really cool insights behind the people who have created some of your favorite coasters. And I definitely learned some things about the personality of the people behind RMC, which I think is what the documentary should have done. Documentaries, like I said before, they focus on people, and getting insight into those people is the most fascinating part of the film. And so those parts, I think, are very successful. The parts that are less successful are just framework narrative problems with the documentary, and that's kind of to be expected from someone who's never made a feature-length documentary before. I'm sure there's a lot of things that they themselves would change, but overall you have to be, and I'm sure they are, incredibly happy with the results. So if you're a coaster enthusiast, 10 out of 10, stop watching the video, go buy it. If you're not a coaster enthusiast, it's a little bit harder to recommend, and here's why. It just doesn't stand up that well as a standalone movie if you're uninitiated to the coaster community. It's certainly interesting to get behind the scenes info about theme parks, about roller coasters, but I think, kind of like I said before, the Imagineering story on Disney Plus, that does a really good job of showing why you should care about some of the accomplishments done by the Walt Disney Company, and sort of helps give you a really great insight into some of the most famous places on Earth. In this specific case, I think telling the chronological history of Rocky Mountain Construction as a company is not strong enough to carry the documentary, and either more focus should have been spent on giving us a character study on Fred Grubb, which was there a little but not that much, and Alan Schilke as well, or telling a story of the construction of a coaster from start to finish and all of the problems that go along with that, and then using that story as a framework to give us more about the company in the background. I think both of those could have been more successful standalone movies, and for that reason, I can't necessarily fully recommend it if you're not a huge coaster fan. So if I had to give a score, again, coaster enthusiasts, 10 out of 10, go see it. If you're not a coaster enthusiast, or maybe you're just expecting a really strong standalone film, probably more of a 5 or a 6 out of 10. That being said, I still really enjoyed it, and I'm also really excited to see what Coaster Studios have in store, because they've really set a new bar for themselves, and I think this goes to show there's tremendous talent on that team, and I'm looking forward to see what they make next. So that's been my review of This Is How We Roll, the new documentary from Coaster Studios. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and of course, I'll put a link in the description so you can go watch the movie yourself if you're interested. Again, I do say I definitely recommend it if this is something you're super, super interested in, or even maybe just a little curious about. I think it's a really cool insight into a cool company doing some very spectacular things. If you like this video, be sure to like it, leave a comment, and share with your friends. I've been Adam with Theme Park Blitz, and I'll see you in our next video.